You're going to hear first from Camryn Cooney, who will be presenting her research on gendered narratives and institutional power in the integration of displaced women in Austria. So, Camryn is from Long Island, and in her final year with Global, she did an internship in Vienna, Austria, with the International Institute for Peace, and has more recently been doing an internship in New York City with Ultra Studio, an architectural and interior design studio. She loves spending time by the ocean and, most importantly, with her dog, Murph. So, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Camryn.
Okay, hello everybody. Give me a second while I set this up. Thank you for the Murph shout out. Those in Australia know and they love him dearly, I'm sure as well. Okay, here we go. Okay, can everyone see this? Good. Okay, beautiful. Hello everybody. So imagine arriving in a new country as a displaced woman, already navigating layered forms of marginalization where gender inequality, legal precarity, and economic instability shape your everyday reality. On top of this, everything from your legal status to your cultural identity is being redefined for you. And before you've even had chance to make sense of it all, you're being told what your own empowerment is required to look like. So welcome to the paradox at the heart of integration policy, where neutrality isn't neutral, empowerment isn't always empowering, and institutions meant to help may be doing the opposite. And so today, forced displacement is at an all-time high with over 110, well, 110 million people displaced globally. But a focal point of my research is centered on the fact that displacement is not experienced equally. So women here make up more than half of the population, yet face compounded forms of marginalization where gender-based violence, economic exclusion, and legal insecurity are compounded, all while expected to integrate into entirely new societies. And so now I chose to focus this research in Vienna, Austria for a very specific reason. Vienna is often seen as a global hub for democracy, peace building, and international organizations. And it's also a space where a lot of these narratives around integration and empowerment are actually produced and circulated within the public. And so, an important factor in this more recent time is also the rise of right wing nationalism in Vienna. It's very much increasingly kind of polarized public discourse around migration in Vienna, especially when targeting Muslim and Middle Eastern communities. And so here, Vienna becomes this really important case study as it kind of sits at the intersection of progressive global discourse and deeply structured and sometimes exclusionary integration systems. And yet, despite all this, the way we talk about displaced women still often reduces them to kind of one or two things, and that is vulnerable or resilient beings. And so, all this foundational information really led me to my research question that asks, how do international discourses or how do institutional discourses of neutrality, empowerment, and integration shape perceptions of displaced women? And what do these narratives allow or silence in terms of their agency? So before getting into my actual research data, it's important to understand, what existing literature already tells us and where it falls short. And so, on one hand, research consistently shows that top down institutional narratives play a very powerful role in shaping integration. So, policies, language, and humanitarian frameworks don't just respond to displacement, but they actively define what successful integration is supposed to look like. And so I also found that there was a very strong feminist critique on humanitarianism, which argues that many empowerment initiatives are actually very performative, where they focus on including women symbolically without addressing the deeper structural inequalities that shape their lives. Which is actually a theme I relay in my findings that came up a lot. So I'll talk about that in a more specific way a little later. And lastly, a large body of research highlights how religion, culture, and community networks are central to how displaced women cope, rebuild identity, and create meanings in new environments. And this can play out in spaces of community to build on shared experiences and cultural practices, to religious adaptive coping mechanisms, which is basically like reinterpreting once traditional patriarchal narratives into stories that give meaning-making significance to women in distress, or in displacement. And these practices are studied and researched to be highly useful and highly effective, especially for women in distress in a new foreign land that's kind of trying to connect back to not only their cultural but their religious roots. And so all of this information is what we already know from past literature, but what's missing is kind of the vital connection of how all of these pieces are actually connected and intersect in practice. And so first, we don't fully understand how institutional narratives themselves are constructed in everyday practice. And so especially like how and what controversial topics are avoided and what actually gets said and what gets left out in these kind of neutral spaces. And most importantly, yeah, we don't understand why religion and lived experience, despite being so central to the literature, are often absent from institutional discourse altogether, and what these avoidances actually mean and do to displaced communities. And so the gap here isn't just about what we know and what we don't, it's more so about the disconnect between what research recognizes as important and what institutions actually prioritize. And so that's kind of the space where my research is trying to build. And so the main goal and aims of this research was to examine how institutions define empowerment, integration, and neutrality, analyze how those definitions shape public perceptions of displaced women, and ultimately reveal what forms of agency are recognized and which are silenced for displaced women. And to do this, I use an intersectional, feminist, constructivist, and decolonial lens, because this isn't just really about policy, it's about power and knowledge, and specifically what forms of knowledge are validated and what are not. And so this research is based off of a qualitative case study that I did in Vienna, Austria during my time interning with the International Institute for Peace. And so to gather my data, I combined field observations, document analysis of policies, and institutional reports from the IIP, and thematic coding. Yeah, and so now over to findings. And if anyone has more questions about methodology and limitations later, please ask. So yeah, three major patterns emerged from my key findings, which were performative empowerment, neutrality as silence, and integration without inclusion. And so all together, these kind of revealed a much deeper issue, that institutional narratives don't just describe reality, but they actually shape it. So first off, across conferences and policy spaces, I consistently saw empowerment framed in economic and institutional terms. So, for example, empowering women was discussed as a way to boost GDP, improve labor markets, and strengthen economies. And now those goals matter in the long run, sure. But when empowerment is reduced to productivity, it shifts the focus away from structural inequality and onto what women can contribute in light of all of these barriers. And so it becomes less about justice and more about usefulness. And so empowerment isn't really empowering, it's conditional here. So another major finding, neutrality as silence, basically surrounds how institutions use their neutrality. And so in theory, neutrality is meant to avoid bias. In practice, I found that it often meant avoiding difficult conversations about racism, religion, or gender inequality. And the problem is, when you don't challenge harmful systems, you end up reinforcing them. And so in this sense, neutrality wasn't passive, it was a form of action. And Austria is a neutral country. The International Institute for Peace worked at a very neutral light. And so I was seeing this theme of neutrality as silence kind of everywhere. And that was a big part of my field observation, was just everything left out of the conversation. So that I really reflected on and took that as a finding itself, just all the absence. And so, yeah, my last finding to present to you today, because there is a lot more, it's just I wanted to kind of shorten it down a bit, is integration without inclusion. where I found that integration policies in Austria are just highly structured, focused on language, employment, and these value courses, which I can get into more in the question section because I didn't really fully detail those out. But if anyone is curious, let me know. But yeah, so interestingly, this integration model frames integration as something that migrants must prove to the government rather than something that societies build together. And so more importantly, they largely exclude religion, culture, and lived experience as viable elements of integration methods and reclaiming identity. And so here, displaced women are included in integration, but only on certain terms, which again, I can detail more so later. But these certain terms often are conditional. So if some of them don't get met, benefits are reduced. And again, with those compounding, you know, in those compounding kind of challenges already put on women once they get into a country, already having these conditions for productivity and economic stability, it can just, it's too much to ask for it without the proper mental support, religious support, spiritual support. And so yeah. And so basically all of this kind of creates what I called, a conditional inclusion where belonging is tied to compliance completely. And so, like any research, there were limitations to this study. And so I did work within one primary institutional setting over a relatively short time frame, about 3 or 4 months. And I also faced a language barrier at times. I don't speak German. I was taking German classes, but did not get very far. But it was great because my institution was very international, meaning that everyone that was working in the space wasn't all from Austria. And so English was our shared language. And so for most of my field observations, event observations, everything like that. Most of it was in English, and the things that weren't, I had translated online doing throughout the coding process. So yeah, the most significant limitation, however, and the most important to talk about today, is that I did not have the opportunity, or I just did not conduct direct interviews with displaced women. So access to displaced communities was highly mediated through institutional gatekeeping, legal protections, and ethical constraints. There was no clear or responsible pathway for me as a researcher to directly engage with participants without risking harm, like pressure or unequal power dynamics. And within a feminist and decolonial framework, it's really important to recognize that just because you can try to access a population doesn't mean you ethically should, especially in contexts shaped by vulnerability and kind of institutional control. And so instead of forcing this access, I really made it like a kind of deliberate choice to then focus on institutional discourse, field observations, and document analysis. Okay, so my key takeaways. So all these, compounded factors really led to one of the most important takeaways of my research findings, which is that institutional narratives define reality. If empowerment is defined economically, then only economic agency is recognized. If integration is defined as compliance, then cultural identity becomes a barrier rather than a part of somebody. If religion is excluded, then the entire methods of meaning making, community building, and identity reclaiming are completely erased. And so what's at stake here isn't just kind of improper language usage of empowerment and all these things, but it's rather whose identities and belongings are understood as valid. And so yeah, so what needs to change here? First off, displaced women must be included in shaping the narratives that actually define them. Secondly, empowerment frameworks must include cultural and spiritual dimensions. And thirdly, neutrality needs to be reevaluated, not just as a way to avoid conflict, but as, taking ethical responsibility for what you are leaving out by being neutral. And yeah, finally, we need intersectional approaches that connect gender, migration, race, and religion rather than treating them as separate issues. And I explored this point a lot more in my written thesis. I didn't really touch on kind of the background information that led up to this big proposed solution. So if anybody again has a question about that, please let me know. And yeah, so if we return to the beginning, imagine again arriving in a new country as a displaced woman, already navigating these layers of inequality, uncertainty, and loss. And now imagine that these systems meant to support you don't just fail to see you fully, but they define you before you've even had the chance to define yourself. And so basically, this research shows that institutional narratives are not just neutral descriptions of reality, but they are powerful forces that shape it. And they determine what empowerment is supposed to look like. They define what successful integration means. And in doing so, they quietly decide which forms of agency are valid and which are ignored. But that impact doesn't just stop at policy. These narratives move beyond institutions into society itself, shaping public perception, reinforcing stereotypes, and in many cases, fueling the very stigma and fear that displaced communities already face. And until we kind of begin to question and reshape these discourses, we're not just limiting inclusion, we're shaping a society that continues to misunderstand, marginalize, and in times endanger the very people it claims to support. So yeah, thank you.